Hello everybody and welcome back to Let's Play ChäoS. I've got a little bit of free time, so I'm getting a little bit ahead on some of my recordings. Why do you think this place called Shibuya draws people so powerfully? Fess suddenly leapt to a completely unrelated topic. I thought she'd start treating me like I was a perv, but instead she disregarded it. 世界を見渡してみてもこんな場所他になかなかないわ Did this have anything to do with the D swords? If it did, I wasn't interested. Or if it didn't, I wasn't interested. I had to find some way of asking Fess how to acquire a real D sword. 新宿でも池袋でもなくて渋谷この町の名前が The two Fess spoke at precisely the same time, their voices coming from behind me and in front of me. Impeccable synchronization. It put me in a peculiar frame of mind somehow. Had Fess split in half, or were both of them the real Fess? Or were both of them imposters? Why, you ask? Because I didn't care either way. The two Fess left a momentary pause. I grew uncomfortable at the thought that they were I grew uncomfortable at the thought that they were watching me from both the front and the back. This is bad. My reason warned me. Could this mean... Maybe she was trying to lure me into a sketchy cult religion. I started to panic. Maybe it would be better to run away. But when I heard Fess's next words, that ceased to be an option. Oh, okay. Turns out next part should have gone an extra 3 minutes. More or less, to finish that up. I had no idea we were that close. Ban returned to the main road from the alley and began walking in the direction of Shibuya Station. Suwa, who had presumably... God. I'm sticking words where they don't need to be. Just because I'm not properly predicting what's next. Suwa, who had assumed that they were going to Shinsen next, grimaced as he followed in Ban's wake.
万有引力のことっすかよく知ってるじゃねえよ。さすがいい大学出てるだけあるな。
Suwa grew downcast at Ban's faintly jesting tone.
あいにく大学じゃオカルトは勉強しなかったっすけどね。オカルトじゃねえよ。世界には引力がアンバランス化してる地域ってのが何か所かある。アンバランス化。グリコが楕円を描いたのもその影響ってこった。GE レートって呼ぶらしい。GE レート。正式名称は何だっつってたかな。グルバケーショングラリッションエラ？引力ならグラビテーションじゃないですか？グラビテーションエラーレート。そうそう、それだ。
Okay.
グラビテーションエラーレート。直訳すると、万有引力の異常値っすか。物理学の辞典を調べりゃ載ってるはずだぜ。載ってたっすかね。
GE rate, an imbalance in the law of universal gravitation. discovered by Isaac Newton, the law of universal gravitation is a fundamental force of nature that works between all substances and forms of energy, etc., which contain mass. A number of strata found layered upon the Earth's surface are said to powerfully influence this law of universal gravitation. Lava beds are a representative example of places that induce local irregularities. The vast sea of trees that lies at the foot of Mount Fuji is such a distinctive instance of this that compasses cease to function there. Researchers have already determined that fossil beds, which contain particularly high levels of iron and calcium, are another type of stratum wherein magnetism rebounds. Also, magnetite. Magnetite has an especially strong effect on gravitation. If naturally produced magnetite, an ore that crystallizes into regular octahedrons, were to be found beneath the Earth in a large enough quantity to merit recognition as a geological dike, such a scenario would indeed equate to the ground itself being formed of magnetite, resulting in an extremely high chance that trace deviations in gravitation would develop there. GE rate refers to the twisted local gravitational values found in areas containing the aforementioned strata. Around the time when Ban's explanation reached a stopping point, the two of them came out on the street by Dugan Hill. The scenery around them became bright and gorgeous all at once.
渋谷の平均 GE レートは世界でもトップクラスらしいぜ。地面に置いたボールが一人でに坂を登っていくようなケースもあるらしい。
Well, that seems like something you'd see in a horror movie.
マジっすか?
Asua had been listening silently up to this point, but now he showed his surprise a bit exaggeratedly.
まるで SF 映画の世界っすね。
I mean, I'd go with more horror movie than sci-fi in that scenario, but sure.
お前の好きなな。
自分は小難しいのは嫌いっすよ。壮大なスケールの映画がいいっす。
知らねえよ。
先輩の説明はすごくもっともらしいっすけど、なかなか信じられないっすよ。GE レートなんて聞いたこともないっすし。
てめえの無知を一般論として語るな。デカに必要なのは事実を客観視することだぞ。
はあ、でも。
As Sua said, research pertaining to GE rates was fairly minor in scale, and one certainly wouldn't hear of it simply by graduating from a normal university. Ban himself hadn't known of it until a few weeks ago.
そもそもまだ肝心の答えを聞いてないっすよ。渋谷の重力がアンバランスだとなんで若者が引きつけられるんすか？
引力と人間ってのは意外と因果関係があるってことだよ。お前、生き物のバイオリズムは月の引力に関係してるっての知ってたか？潮の満ち引きだけじゃねえんだぜ。
ウミガメの産卵には月の影響があるらしいってのはどっかで耳にしたことがあるっす。
ああ、必ず満月の夜に産卵するってやつだな。
That seems like a very weird thing, to be honest.
だがウミガメだけじゃねえ。他に有名なのだとサンゴが産卵するのも満月の夜だ。
Okay, sure, I'll just take your word for it because I can't be bothered to see if that's true.
海の中が雪降ってるみたいになるやつっすね。
満月の夜は引力も強くなってるって科学的に実証されてんだ。当然人間にもその影響は及んでる。
Yes, so people say, because people say that people become worse drivers when there's a full moon.
人の出産にもってことっすか？
出産だけじゃねえよ。バイオリズムって言ったろ。普通の生理現象はもちろん、交通事故や事件、 病気、食欲とか性欲とかにも密接なつながりがある。興奮すると頭に血が上ってるって言うだろう。あれは月の引力に引っ張られてるんだよ。
そりゃ極論だと思うっすよ。
Yeah, inclined to agree.
まるで個々の感情なんて関係なくて全部月のせいだって言ってるようなもんじゃないっすか。
そこまでは言わねえがな。集団心理って言うだろう。この町に来た途端に楽しい気分になったり、ちょっと無茶したくなったりするかもしんねえんじゃねえの？
You know, like, using little metal stakes and, putting somebody or hanging somebody up on a wall.
ニュージェネの一連の事件に対する反応だってそうだ。この町でそのニュースを見た連中は大抵反応が同じだ。どいつもこいつも楽しんでやがる。自分だけは被害者にならないって気持ちだ。対岸の火事を眺めていい気になってる。
そういう集団心理も GE レートのせいってことっすか？
可能性としてはありだろう。渋谷に来たら楽しい気分になるってのが若い奴らの頭の中に無意識にすり込まれれば、
若者がこの街に惹かれる理由になるってわけっすね。
As expected, Suo was a quick study, Ben thought admiringly. He was still young, but this side of him was rather impressive. And what set him apart from other youngsters was how, instead of simply following his seniors, he argued back when he had doubts about something or found it peculiar.
GE レートについては一応分かったっすけど、それでどうやって犯人を探すんすか？もし GE レートに影響されて今回みたいな事件が起きたってなら、何百年も前から似たようなことが起きてないと変なんじゃん。
そいつはこれから調べりゃいいさ。専門家だな。
先輩は調べないんすか？
俺はデカだぞ。
Yeah, he's not a specialist in the occult. Van smirked.
調べるのはニュージェネのことだけだ。そのために今日はわざわざ仕事サボって現場の GE レートを測ったんだ。もしこれまでの一連の現場の GE レートが異常を示したなら、
まさか。
Eyes round, Suo stopped in place. He appeared to have picked up on what Ban was trying to say.
事件は GE レートが異常を示している場所で起こるってことっすか？だとしたら次の事件が起こる場所をある程度予測できるんすね。
Well, in theory, you would just be narrowing it down to a handful of locations, which, if it's true that Shibuya's GE rate is top class even compared to the rest of the world, is probably going to result in you having a decent number of places you'd have to presumably keep officers standing around on the off chance that eventually you have a case happen there.
まだそう決まったわけじゃねえよ。それをこれから調べんだ。
And that just seems, to be honest, it seems like a very inefficient use of resources, depending on what resources you have to actually spare and what it would actually take to properly watch over all of those potential crime scenes. There was something to the city, something unidentified, hidden in the depths behind its gaudy exterior. And maybe it was a Pandora's box that humans mustn't touch. So Ben thought to himself as he surveyed the people going down the road. When I heard those words, I couldn't stand it any longer. Vess kept on avoiding the subject by bringing up stuff I didn't care about. I had zero interest in things like her great will or why young people were drawn to Shibuya. I only wanted to ask her one thing. I demanded a fess, mustering all my courage. Without any change in her world-weary expression, Fess dropped her gaze to the D-sword she was carrying. Despite its enormity, she appeared to handle it with ease. I wondered if the truth was that she possessed some kind of ridiculous strength. What's with dropping all those hints and then refusing to tell me the most crucial part of it? Presumably that's why we were told to find ourselves, if I'm recalling correctly, in an earlier part. I believe that was Senna that told us that. She didn't know. Then how the hell had Fess obtained the sword she was holding in her hand right now? Okay, in that case, that means we know that we have the power. You know, we're gonna He-Man this. We just don't currently know how to actually use said power. So if you reverse this, that meant people without the power couldn't see them? I could see it, clear as day, but what power? Did I have the same kind of supernatural power that allowed there to be two Fess standing before me right now? Yes, and that's kind of the whole reason why we are trying to get our hands on one in the first place. If it was the power's fault that Shogun and Yuo were meddling with me, I didn't want that kind of meaningless power. Except, even so, I wanted a D-sword. Fess had said it would grant me salvation. It didn't matter to me whether a great will existed or why young people were attracted to Shibuya. Actually, now that I think about it, I think it was Fess that told us to find ourselves, not Senna. I don't know why I was thinking Senna. I didn't need any kind of power, and I didn't want to get caught up in anything bothersome, but to slip away from Shogun and Yua, the only thing I had to get my hands on was a sword. But as before, Fess's answer remained ambiguous. I bit my lip and thought frantically about how to squeeze more information out of her. But given how poor I was at talking with 3D people, I couldn't come up with a single effective method. I had tried thinking about eroge situations that might prove to be helpful examples, but all that came to mind were barbaric things like making her drink an aphrodisiac, or tying her up, or confining her. I might be the worst kind of human being. Facing me with her back, Fess began walking slowly to the depths of the tunnel. Now that she said it, I realized we hadn't so much as introduced ourselves.
Nishijo, Takumi.
I couldn't see Fess's Ayase's expression from my position. I didn't know why she'd laughed at me. Ayase retreated into the distance. Wondering what had happened to the other Ayase, I gingerly turned around. Her form had already vanished, leaving behind not the slightest trace. Had she literally disappeared, or simply walked out of the subway? Ayase called her a delusion, but was that the power of the D-sword? I returned my line of sight to the subway interior. Ayase was just beginning to climb up another set of stairs located about 50 meters deeper down the tunnel. At last, I completely lost sight of her. All that remained afterward was the subway's eerie silence. I lacked the boldness to yell out and stop her. As for running after her, I was exhausted, and my sense that it would just be a hassle overruled everything else. In the end, all I could do was timidly return home so as to avoid being spotted by Yua or the police. It felt like it'd been a while since the last time I'd gone back to my base. In reality, though, I'd only been away for half a day. I'd left my PC on, and the Sarah in my screensaver radiated pale light and a smile into the rest of the dark room. I locked the door from the inside and flung myself heavily down on the sofa. When I closed my eyes, I couldn't help recalling what had happened today. Of all things, to be suspected by the police. They must be making some kind of mistake. I wasn't even capable of murder. To do a better job of investigating, this isn't a game. They probably thought that because creepy otakus don't have much social knowledge, I wouldn't be able to object even if they set me up as the criminal. Since they had totally failed to find the true perpetrator, they wanted to maintain their reputation by using me as their scapegoat. Damn it. What should I do to clear up their accusations? I shuddered as I remembered the scene at that cafe. There was someone out there far more terrifying than the police. Yuba was my enemy. Lately, I thought I was safe because she hadn't shown any signs of movement. I'd been ecstatic, thinking she wouldn't attempt to make contact with me anymore. But today, I'd been forced to realize my mistake. I needed a D-sword to resist the likes of her. I cast a glance at the cheap sword looking up to the one side of my PC. It was a fake. According to ISA, a D-sword was only visible to those with the power. Nanami had clearly seen my sword on the day I bought it. Besides, unlike ISA or Senna's swords, this one didn't glow. Where could the real thing be? I had to acquire one ASAP. If not, it would be the end of me. There couldn't be anything worse than getting wrapped up in something this unreasonable.
あなたは DID 多重人格なんです。
You're wrong. That's impossible. There's no way it could be true. Don't they say that multiple personalities are really rare in Japan? You have seen too many movies and novels. I don't have multiple personalities. There's no proof for it anywhere.
違う。あれは違う。
But that chat log was consistent with what Yua had told me.
あんなの捏造だ。証拠にはならない。
But nor was there any proof that it didn't have multiple personalities.
先生は僕を多重人格だなんて診断しなかった。
Were the doctors testing for that? Because if not, obviously they're not going to diagnose you as having multiple personalities if they're not testing for that. You know, the one time we went there, they were testing for sleepwalking, you know, some sort of sleep disorder type thing. But for some reason, Dr. Takashina went away. Or Takashi. I don't know what the hell I was thinking Takashina. Whatever.
僕が一番よく知ってる。
But I don't understand myself. I was assaulted by a tingling sensation at the back of my neck. The unusual presence, the gaze of someone watching me. Whose eyes are those eyes?
そうだ。将軍だ。あいつが犯人だ。チャットログにもそう書いてあったじゃないか。ユアは将軍の手下だし。ニュージェネ事件だって全部将軍が。
But did Shogun truly exist? Was not that itself a delusion?
僕はまともだ。まともなんだ。そうでしょ。
Cradling my head, I shouted at no one. The one who replied was...
メールだよボケナス
Sarah? I dragged myself over to my PC and checked my email. A Grim was the sender. The title was Found Something Interesting. It must be more of his trolling. He was trying to get my head to shut down again. I couldn't afford to go along with Grimm's games now, but for the time being, I stuck to just reading the text of his mail. A video taken by the new gen perp? My fingers trembled against the mouse. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the email. Did he mean the criminal showed up in there? Who was it? Surely not me. My desire to see it warred with my longing not to. This was proof. Proof that I wasn't the criminal, or else proof that I was. I didn't know which would turn out to be the case. It was akin to a gamble. Sensing the ringing of my internal alarm bells, I moved my mouse cursor up to where the link was located. But I couldn't quite work up the courage to click the URL.
私 あなたを助けたい。
Shut up. Don't treat me like a criminal. Don't act like you sympathize with me. I didn't do it. You herself was the one on the killer's side. Furious, I clicked the URL. A YouTube page opened up. The word loading appeared in the video window.
僕じゃない僕じゃない僕じゃない僕じゃない僕じゃない僕じゃない僕じゃない僕じゃない僕じゃない僕じゃない僕じゃない僕じゃない僕じゃない僕じゃない僕じゃない僕じゃない僕じゃない。
In actuality, it only took about 10 seconds to load, but to me those 10 seconds felt like eternity. At last, it finished loading, and the video began playing back. It was a film of a very dark place. The background was pitch black. It looked like somewhere indoors. I mean, that picture looks more like somewhere outdoors, but that's besides the point, I guess. In an attempt to somehow gather information from within the video window, I brought my face closer to the monitor. It was dim and hard to see, but several girls and guys were there. They were raising their voices, being terribly boisterous. Perhaps because of how low the audio rate was, or perhaps because the emotions of the people in the film were so heightened, I couldn't catch what they were saying. On occasion, they let out violent shouts, their voices breaking horribly. After watching for a little while, I grasped that there were 5 people present, including the cameraman. That made 6. The cameraman didn't enter the screen in the slightest. Though I could tell there were 5 people, the darkness prevented me from seeing their faces clearly. As though to affirm one another, they caressed each other's heads, patted each other's shoulders, and embraced. I heard a girl's high-pitched weeping as if she'd been overcome by emotion. It was certainly a singular spectacle, but how was this video related to New Gen? Was the New Gen criminal really the one who had filmed it? At least, I had no recollection of taping something like this. After some time, the videographer holding the camera began moving forward. His 5 subjects, who had been about 5 meters away, gradually began to show up larger and larger. The video was rather grainy, but someone had lowered the bitrate as much as possible when they maybe someone had lowered the bitrate as much as possible when they encoded it so as to make the file smaller. Modern video cameras should be night vision capable, so I wasn't sure why this cameraman hadn't taken advantage of that. Was it an old camera, maybe? The camera panned from side to side, revealing the surrounding scenery. What I'd assumed to be a pitch-black background was in fact the night sky. In other words, the place being filmed was outside. The reason not a single building appeared on the tape was because this was the roof of a high-rise. The 5 girls and guys were at the edge of the roof of a very tall building. Close behind them lay a sheer precipice. Below were the lavish lights of Shibuya one could see from tall locations. I finally understood what this video signified, why he'd said it had been taken by the New Gen criminal. The case in which 5 people jumped off the roof of Cornelius Tower, which should have been sealed off like a locked room situation in a detective novel. The first in the sequence of New Gen incidents, the one that could have been either murder or suicide. If this film portrayed the 5 who had jumped to their deaths, then it meant there had been a 6th person on the scene when it happened. The 5 shown here hadn't been acting boisterous. All had sunk down on the spot and were screaming and crying as they pressed their bodies together, unable to give up even though they were fated to die soon. One shook his head and sobbed, "No, no." One fell to her knees and wept with her shoulders heaving, clutching at her hair. One turned to the cameraman, crying, asking why he was doing something like this. One had already gone mad and was laughing as tears poured down his face. There lay a raging desire to live, a searing longing not to die. Disconsolate anger. Why does this have to happen to us? Many raw emotions forming a downward spiral. In opposition to that, bizarrely, the cameraman's voice never entered the video. This cameraman was uncannily calm.
Yamero.
Nothing would change, no matter how much I pleaded with a video that had been filmed almost a month earlier. I knew it was meaningless, but I found myself unconsciously shouting at the monitor. But there was no way my words would reach them, and the camera drew even closer to the 5 of them. Perhaps driven by fear, they retreated from the camera as though crawling. But escape was impossible. Close behind them was the very edge of the heliport. It had nothing resembling a safety fence. They no longer had anywhere to run. If they scooted back a little further, they'd fall. The cameraman, utterly heedless of how they begged for their lives, continued advancing the camera on them as if he meant to drive them distraught. He had driven them this far into a corner, but he sought to take no other action. Though they had neither signaled to each other nor experienced some kind of trigger, the five who had been sobbing in grief suddenly fell silent all at once. They stood up. The wind was strong on the roof of Cornelia's tower. Pushed on by the wind, they seemed about to stumble. One misstep, and they would fall. As though they had given up, they joined their hands. They gripped each other's hands firmly.
Yose, yamero, hayamaru na.
Silence. I almost thought that even the sound of the wildly blowing wind had stopped. All I could hear were the cars running along the Shuto Expressway below the building. The cameraman still did nothing. And one of the 5 softly muttered. I froze in front of the monitor, feeling as though a cold hand had grabbed hold of my heart. This was the first Nugent incident, wasn't it? The phrase, "whose eyes are those," was supposed to be the dying message from Vampire House, the 4th case. This is crazy. The film continued, ignoring my internal screams. As they held hands, the 5 slowly stepped forward. As though there were a road ahead of them, they collapsed into the night scenery of the Megalopolis. That is such a weird word to say. I bit my lip and covered my eyes. The group diving wasn't suicide. This, too, had been a homicide. The criminal had been there when it happened. And I knew. The cameraman, mixed in with the sound of the powerful wind on the rooftop, mixed in with the sound of 5 people intently weeping, mixed in with the honking of the cars on the expressway below, I had distinctly heard another, fainter sound. It was a sound like that of metal creaking. The sound I had heard when the cameraman advanced. The sound of a wheelchair.
あの時、僕の前に現れたのは現実だったんだね。カメラの目線が低すぎだよ、将軍。
Okay. We have entered a new chapter. We're going to go ahead and this part here, I went a little bit longer. Because, you know, I didn't want to stop it partway through watching the video. So, yeah. So that's going to be it for this part. Quick reminder that I do have a Patreon and a Discord. I do highly recommend that you join the Discord if you want to stay up to date on what's going on with the channel. That is my go-to place for posting about any potential interruptions to my recording schedule, any potential interruptions to my streaming schedule, which is something I've been trying to get into somewhat recently. And just any other potential issues that might arise and have some sort of effect on the channel. And as for the Patreon, that is probably the easiest and best way to support the channel if you find yourself enjoying this series or any of the other series that I have uploaded on the channel. But that is going to be it for this part. Like I said, I will see you all next time, but until then, a goodbye and farewell.